it's working. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join your national seminar and to offer some of my ideas about the my own perspectives on eco-criticism. And I will not necessarily be highlighting the concept of the Anthropocene in this talk, but I wanted to explore a particular line of thought that I've been pursuing in my own eco-critical efforts for many years, for the past several decades. And I'm calling this talk, as you can see, Seeking Awareness, Pursuing Poignancy, and the Literary Imagination, applications of the arithmetic of compassion to environmental thought. The arithmetic of compassion is a cluster of psychological ideas that have become increasingly important in my work as an environmental humanities scholar and have determined much of my own thinking about environmental texts of various kinds, not only literary texts, but works in the visual arts and film and music and various other texts that I think demonstrate these psychological ideas. So in fact, the opening image on the slide is of a work of art by a Seattle-based artist named Chris Jordan, whom I'll mention later in my talk, whose work is directly relevant to this psychological paradigm that we call the arithmetic of compassion. In this case, trying to present the phenomenon of plastic bottles, the numerous plastic bottles consumed every few minutes at the time when he was producing this work of art, this digital composition. And I'll explain this work a little bit later, but the whole idea is that you're supposed to look at it not only from a distance, as it's portrayed here, but actually walk up close to the image, or you observe it digitally on the artist's website and have the image move toward you so you can see the individual plastic bottles and realize that each of these bottles represents the numerous other bottles that are consumed. This is an idea related to the paradigm that we call the arithmetic of compassion. Just a second. So I've been working on ideas related to awareness for many years. And actually, I'm going to try to reduce something on my slide so I can see. Okay, so for the past 3 decades or more, in 31 books and hundreds of articles, I've been trying to understand the relationship between environmental awareness, being sensitive to various aspects of the natural world and our human relationship to the larger world, and how various communication strategies have contributed to this awareness, this sensitivity to this complex, multifaceted relationship. And in turn, after we are aware of certain aspects of the environment, and in particular aware of various degradations of the environment, how does this awareness relate to environmental action or inaction? This is something I've been contemplating since the 1980s when I was working on my PhD dissertation, and it emerged in my first book dating back to 1992, where in the conclusion, the coda, I asked, perhaps most importantly, how does writing about the environment, what we used to call environmental or call nature writing, how does it influence people's attitudes and behavior? And I've attempted from various angles to explore this for many decades now. For example, in 2004, Canadian anthropologist Terry Satterfield and I published a book called What's Nature Worth? Narrative Expressions of Environmental Values, where our goal was to use literature to try to understand how it is that people construct their preferences for particular aspects of the environment or even particular landscapes, and how do humans form attachment to these aspects of the more than human world. Particularly, how does story the language of story play a role in helping us to cultivate our own values and communicate these values to others. So what we did was interview a dozen prominent writers, including such figures as Terry Tempest Williams and Gary Paul Nabhan and other really famous contemporary environmental writers, and ask them about their strategies in conveying their own values by way of story and actually constructing their feelings, their understanding of their feelings about the environment by producing these stories and thinking through their own values in this way. And so this is an aspect of awareness um, related specifically to storytelling that we pursued in this project. And there are many other projects that I'm not going to go into, but one that I'll leap ahead to discuss briefly is a book called Ecocritical Aesthetics, Language, Beauty, and the Environment, a project that sought to highlight the role of beauty in ecocritical analysis, including the use of beauty as a way of stirring environmental consciousness and action. In fact, my particular essay for this book focuses on the literature of sustainability and how various examples of environmental poetry sought to touch upon certain aspects of sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, and to raise readers' awareness of sustainability and inspire certain behavioral changes among readers, specifically through beauty, through beautiful language. As my colleague Peter Quigley quoted me in the introduction to the book, that the beauty of nature and beautiful representations of environmental ideas in cultural expression actually became subsumed among many other scholarly concerns for eco-critics. And people essentially forgot to talk explicitly about beauty for many years in the field of eco-criticism, even though many of us were drawn to the field of literary studies, and specifically to eco-criticism, because we love the texts that we're studying. We're attracted to their beauty. Often beauty is not explicitly discussed in scholarly writing and in conferences and various occasions. And so we sought in this project to bring beauty back into the discussion, to refer explicitly to aesthetic aspects of environmental communication. A few years later, or a year later, my colleagues from India, Swarnalata Rangaranjan and Vidya Sarveswaran, and I published a book attempting to show the connections between the field of eco-criticism and environmental communication, essentially to bring together these sister disciplines, very closely related disciplines, both of which seek to understand how to convey environmental ideas more effectively. And so we thought, if we attempted to combine the voices, the strategies, the terminologies of these two parallel disciplines, perhaps we could generate greater insights into what it means to communicate ideas more effectively. And when I talk about effective communication, this is what I mean by the phrase in the title of my talk, pursuing poignancy. How do we develop poignant means of communication that help us to reach readers in a deeper way? And this is the essence of the psychological paradigm that we call the arithmetic of compassion. It's an idea that really came together in a book project that I published in 2015 with my father, who's a prominent psychologist named Paul Slovic. We published this book, Numbers and Nerves, Information, Emotion, and Meaning in a World of Data, which explores various psychological ideas such as psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, the prominence effect, and various others in the context of humanitarian and environmental crises. And we also look explicitly at communication strategies that help us to overcome certain forms of insensitivity to information that are directly related to our failure to respond or act effectively in response to many of these important challenges. And so some of the key ideas that I'll emphasize in my brief talk today will be psychic numbing and the trans-scalar imaginary, which is essentially what the artist Chris Jordan, whom I mentioned earlier, is exploring in his work. Here's a picture of the two of us giving a presentation shortly after that book was published. So how do we overcome the intrinsic psychological tendencies such as psychic numbing and pseudo-inefficacy? Psychic numbing referring specifically to the fact that the human mind struggles to respond to numerical information as that information refers to larger and larger numbers. In fact, the human mind becomes numb as soon as we start talking about more than one phenomenon. As soon as we move beyond singularities to multiple individuals or multiple victims or species that are in distress or in jeopardy, we start being less sensitive. So basically, the strategies for communicating in order to overcome insensitivity to information highlight the importance of multi-dimensional communication, looking at a problem from various perspectives, focusing on images of individual examples or case studies, telling the stories of these individuals, and by understanding the psychological processes that we are experiencing as we try to respond to information. The notion of adopting multi-dimensional approaches to communicating quantitative information about various issues comes in part from sociologist Edward Tufte, who's a specialist in communicating data, communicating statistics. And in a 2006 book called Beautiful Evidence, Tufte argues that we need a diversity of evidence, a diversity of multi-dimensional forms of evidence in order to explain something effectively. So this notion of adopting multi-dimensional approaches in a communication effort comes in part from him. So written language and other modes of communication can have dramatic impacts on audiences, and certain types of narratives we found are especially capable of achieving poignancy, this powerful effect. One is to reduce large-scale phenomena to individuals, what psychologists would call singularities. Another is to work across scales from single to multiple, from small to large. And this is what I mean when I refer to the trans-scalar imaginary. In addition, presenting stories of vulnerability is a way of actually capturing the attention and concern of audiences. And then finally, stories that reveal dramatic change in the speaker, a conversion of some kind, often an empowering conversion that shows the speaker has agency and the ability to change their behavior, their attitudes, and make a difference, is an important way of conveying information meaningfully. So when I refer to poignancy, I'm interested in the possibility that presenting information effectively can have a powerful effect on individuals, on the general public, and on political decision makers, and others who have the ability to help us improve our societies. And the word poignancy refers specifically to a keen emotional feeling. And it refers originally in Old French to the idea of pricking or poking us in a way that captures attention. One example of this is Al Gore in some of his famous work on climate change, lecturing with a picture of the Earth behind him, what he and many others refer to as the pale blue dot, that this is our only planet, the only place where our species lives. We need to take care of this pale blue dot, not take it for granted. To me, that's a very poignant image. So one of the essential ideas in the arithmetic of compassion comes from Mother Teresa, who stated, "If I look at the mass, I will never act, but if I look at the one, I will." And this statement attributed to Mother Teresa suggests that we are moved to act, to engage, to try to make a difference if we focus on the individuals, not at the massive problem that we may be facing. So her observations capture a powerful and deeply unsettling insight into human nature. Most people are caring and will exert a great effort to rescue the one, the individual, whether human or not human, whose needy plight comes to their attention, but they will not act to help the many. So why is this the case, and what can be done about it? So we might expect, if we were a completely rational species, that if we value lives in a certain way, human lives or other lives, that each life would be essentially of equal value, and that a figure like the one on the left showing a linear relationship between numbers of lives and values of those lives would be the way that we think about lives. Or as the number of lives potentially in jeopardy increases, those lives would be of greater and greater importance, and there would be an exponential shift upwards um, as we experience potential critical colony collapse for a colony of honeybees or other pollinators, or as more and more human lives are in jeopardy, we would be more alert and more concerned. But the reality is that, and this is shown through empirical experiments by psychologists, we begin to demonstrate diminished sensitivity and concern for lives as soon as the number increases from 1 to 2. So that by the time we're talking about 6, 8, 10 lives, let alone 100 or 1,000 lives, each individual life becomes adds very little to our feeling, our emotional response. This is what we call psychic numbing or psychophysical numbing. So, in one of the articles for the 2015 book, Numbers and Nerves, Paul Slovic and Daniel Westphal, a Swedish psychologist, write that our capacity to feel is limited. And psychological research depicts that psychic numbing is not beneficial as we experience it in the context of emotion today. Rather, it leads to apathy and inaction, consistent what is seen repeatedly in response to mass murder and genocide and various other environmental situations, such as our response to global climate change, when we hear that numerous people are at risk and various other environmental phenomena are occurring on a large scale that should provoke worry and concern, but in fact tend to provoke complacency. So we're highly sensitive to some information and insensitive to other information. So, for instance, related to waves of refugees that have occurred in the past few decades, such as people trying to escape the civil war in Syria, there have been numerous media reports of large numbers of refugees attempting to leave their homeland and travel by boat to Europe and other places where they might live more safely and escape the violence of their homeland. But there was very little public response to the massive numbers of refugees conveyed in articles like this April 2015 article from The Economist. But when one individual Syrian child was presented in a photograph in the New York Times in September 2015, the name of the boy was Elan Kurdi. And this particular photograph, this one image of an individual child, had a dramatic effect in galvanizing public attention and also political action to try to quell the violence that was leading to the Syrian civil war and to accommodate the needs of refugees. So Google search statistics in September 2015 showed this huge spike after that one photograph was displayed in the New York Times. And after a few weeks, fewer and fewer people were paying attention to the individual story of that one boy, but there was a continued elevation of interest as displayed in Google searches for Syria and refugees because the public had been inspired to pay more attention to those topics. So one of the psychological ideas related to this phenomenon of representing a large-scale problem with an individual example, and trying to encourage the public to move back and forth cognitively between the small and the large, the one and the many, is what Chris Jordan calls the transscalar imaginary. And he uses this principle in many of his digital compositions. This is a picture of his art studio where he works on computers and produces these digital compositions in Seattle, Washington, such as the one that he's standing next to on the left, which is a modern reimagining of the painter Botticelli's famous painting of the Birth of Venus. And essentially it looks like, if you could just see the picture that his hand is on, the image, that he's recreated Botticelli's famous painting. But if you look at it very closely, you see that it actually consists of thousands of plastic bags. And the caption of Jordan's recreation of the image, the caption indicates how many plastic bags are used in the world and released into the oceans every few minutes. And so it's actually a picture that is meant to critique our use of plastic bags, which are destroying the ocean, which produced the mythological character Venus. Here's the plastic bottles image that I used in my cover slide, which is called Plastic Bottles 2007. And I showed you the top version, which is the distant view of that image. And as if you were viewing this in an art gallery and walked up close to it, you would see the individual plastic bottles. And the idea is that you're supposed to walk up to it and then walk back and move back and forth between the close-up and the faraway views. The caption to this image is what is indicated here below the three different versions of it, where Jordan had written below it, depicts 2 million plastic beverage bottles, the number used in the United States every 5 minutes. And so the idea is to be aware of the huge number of plastic bottles that people are consuming in this country. And of course, you can extrapolate from that and imagine what that means in a global sense. But then to realize that every individual bottle that you use is related to this very large consumption problem, which is also leading to important environmental concerns. And when I interviewed him for the book Numbers and Nerves, Jordan told the story of actually viewing this composition in an art museum with a friend of his who happened to be holding a plastic water bottle. And he got the message of the image as he was looking at it and was ashamed of the fact that he was holding a water bottle. And at first he said, oh, it's just one bottle. It's not really that important. But then he had a kind of revelation. I understand what you're trying to say in this piece. You're showing 2 million one bottles. And thus this one bottle that I'm holding is a big part of the problem. So if we turn to literature, and thinking about the power of singularity and the possibility of transscalar representation of problem in a literary work, let me give you a small example here, which is one of the most famous works of American environmental literature. It's Aldo Leopold's essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, which was published in 1949. And the basic idea of this short essay is to demonstrate the importance of protecting predators such as wolves in ecosystems, because predators are vital to the health of an ecosystem by keeping down the numbers of deer and other animals that if left to populate without interference by predators would have too many of them, would overpopulate and would destroy the vegetation and help to produce erosion and other kinds of environmental problems. So wolves and other predators are vital to ecosystems. But when Leopold was a young natural resource manager, before he became a writer, He thought that his job was to increase the number of deer in an ecosystem so that hunters would have more deer to pursue, and that the way to do that, he felt, was to kill as many predators as he could. So in this short essay, he tells the story of shooting at a bunch of wolves, killing an adult wolf, and then as he approaches the wolf who's dying, he has a revelation, a change of heart, and he transforms his own view of this. And this is the famous passage where he walks up to an old wolf and sees the fierce green fire dying in her eyes, and realizes at that moment that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed that fewer wolves would create a hunter's paradise of many deer. In fact, you need wolves in an ecosystem. But he tells a story of this one individual wolf dying, emphasizing the idea of singularity rather than talking about all of the wolves dying. He focuses on this one. And then the next half of the essay moves to a much larger scale, talking about the efforts to remove or extirpate wolves in state after state in the US, and how this has caused tremendous environmental problems. And so he shifts from the individual narrative to the large scale philosophical argument and ecological argument, demonstrating a trans-scalar movement akin to what Chris Jordan is attempting to produce in his visual art. We see this often in literary works, including, for example, a famous book by Svetlana Alexievich, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2015. One of her books is called Stories from Chernobyl, The Oral History of a Nuclear Disaster, about the Chernobyl disaster from 1986. And what she does is tell story after story of individual Chernobyl workers and residents attempting to convey through the singular narratives, the individual narratives, the meaning of the meltdown at Chernobyl and the environmental degradation that occurred as a result of that nuclear disaster. And so here's just a quotation from one specific example, representing the voice of the wife of a deceased fireman who died because of the disaster at Chernobyl. So you can see it's very vivid, very graphic, and it tells an individual story rather than simply presenting the statistics or the data about that disaster. So as the field of eco-criticism has continued to evolve, there have been a number of examples in recent years of eco-critics focusing on information or information management. Many people these days allude to Rob Nixon's book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, particularly interested in his concept of slow violence. But for me, one of the key ideas from Nixon's book is this issue of apprehension. How do we grasp ideas related to the environment? To apprehend is to actually grasp information. And he argues that the great problem of slow violence is that it's exceedingly difficult for us to perceive the phenomena such as climate change, extinction, structural violence that disadvantages groups of people in various types of societies, and that we need to have more effective ways of communicating this information. To me, that's an aspect of the eco-critical focus on information. Heather Hauser has written a number of articles about this, such as her 2014 essay on managing information and materiality in Infinite Jest, a novel, and Running the Numbers, which is the digital composition series by Chris Jordan. And more recently, Hauser has published a book called InfoWhelm, an eco-critical book focusing on our struggle to convey information, mostly about climate change. Numbers and Nerves, the book that my father and I did in 2015, is a study of information, essentially, and the psychological and communication aspects of information. Ursula Heise well-known eco-critic from UCLA, has also written about this in such projects as Imagining Extinction, the Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, where she writes about a variety of different types of narratives attempting to convey the meaning of endangered species. So another aspect of all of this is the idea that, and this is directly related to some of my own work as an eco-critic, is the notion that eco-critics um, should consider doing, not just communicating in traditional ways in journal, writing articles for journals, publishing books, and communicating to colleagues in conferences like this one, but actually to try to find ways to go public. So in 2016, I became aware of a new book called Academics Going Public: How to Write and Speak Beyond Academe. And it occurred to me that a natural extension of some of my own efforts to communicate poignantly about issues in the world, humanitarian and environmental issues that I felt were important, would be to try to reach out beyond my normal audiences. So the collection, Academics Going Public, includes an article by someone named Kat Stein about writing press releases. Not all academics necessarily feel that they're interested in or capable of communicating to general audiences outside of academia. So one possibility would be for scholars to write press releases and send these to journalists whose job is to try to communicate to these broader audiences. So this particular article by Stein focuses on how to present your research in a way that it might catch the eye of journalists and inspire them to present your work to these broader audiences. There are other chapters in that book, Academics Going Public, that focuses on how to write an opinion piece for the mass media. And in fact, that's one of the things that I've tried to do on numerous occasions, sometimes with Paul Slovic, other times by myself. And so at this point, we've published dozens of these opinion articles, what we call op-eds in the United States, conveying ideas from the arithmetic of compassion, the psychological ideas, and attempting to apply these ideas to various crises around the world, humanitarian crises and environmental crises. So we've published these in the New York Times, the prominent journal called Environment, and also in local newspapers, and in recent years, primarily on our website, Arithmetic of Compassion. So related to this idea of going public with our own work, our own ideas, is the notion of using our skills as teachers to train fellow citizens to write their own testimonies that they might publish, that they might use in a public format to speak to others about concerns that they have. So over the years, I've prepared numerous writing workshops, specifically training groups of students or citizens to prepare their own personal testimony on issues that they care about. This particular image shows an environmental writing workshop I was teaching in Malaysia in 2015 to a group of students from many different countries. Here we see a Nigerian student giving testimony about the problem of desertification in his home region of northern Nigeria, where the Sahara Desert is encroaching due to global climate change. So he's written a short statement of 600 or 700 words, and here he's presenting it out loud to his fellow students. So many of the ideas of the arithmetic of compassion have worked their way into this concept of personal testimony, which I've attempted to present to groups like this. Here is another group of students working on personal testimonies on the island of Guam in the Pacific Ocean during an island sustainability testimony workshop, where they're preparing testimonies to publish on the website of the Center for Sustainability at their university. And here's one of the students, Ariel Lowe, who wrote her testimony as a poem about a dangerous type of invasive beetle that was taking over the island of Guam due to climate change. It was the changing climate was facilitating the encroachment of this beetle. And so she wrote her poem, and then she recorded herself performing the poem and published this on YouTube as a result of that workshop. So it's an example of trying to find poignant ways of communicating to raise public awareness, and use literature, even the voices of emerging writers, such as an undergraduate student like this, in order to convey in a powerful way an important issue to as broad an audience as possible. So on the Arithmetic of Compassion website, which is a spin-off of the Numbers and Nerves book, as soon as we published the book, we created a website in order to present the ideas in a different format that would be more readily available to people who just go to the website, and introduce the key concepts from psychology of human sensitivity and insensitivity to information, and other key concepts from the environmental humanities, such as slow violence, narrative empathy, and the notion of studying empirically through empirical ecocriticism the impacts of different types of texts on audiences. So all of this is on the website. Here's the current URL. The current link is arithmeticofcompassion.org. And then also in the blog section of the website, which is regularly updated and now includes more than 100 essays, interviews, and reviews highlighting the relevance of arithmetic of compassion to both chronic and acute contemporary examples of humanitarian and environmental crises. The hope is to show people how to communicate effectively in relation to issues that they happen to be concerned about in their own lives and their own parts of the world. For instance, here's an interview that I conducted in 2021 with a prominent environmental writer named Sharmin Apt Russell, related to a book she had just published about child malnutrition around the world, which is an example of slow violence. Very difficult to perceive this problem. And she emphasizes the role of storytelling, representing individual case studies, in addition to the large-scale data about the seriousness of the problem of childhood malnutrition. But in the interview that I conducted with her, she writes very effectively about the strategies she was using in her book project. Likewise, I interviewed a Canadian doctoral student named Amy Donovan, related to her work on communicating trans-species empathy. How do we write about our concern for other species in order to help readers feel empathy for these other species? She happens to be particularly interested in communicating the vulnerability of whales, and she wrote an essay for a book called Cold Water Oil: Offshore Petroleum Cultures, 2021 book, an article that I found particularly captivating and impressive. It's called Raw, Dense, and Loud: A Whale's Perspective on Cold Water Energy. And one of the things I noticed about her article was how it used multi-dimensional prose of the kind that Edward Tufte seems to advocate in his work on representing data or conveying statistics in meaningful ways. She doesn't just give the data. In her article, she starts with a fictional narrative from the perspective of an individual imaginary whale, a fictional 4-year-old female whale in the northern seas, who observes her mother getting entangled in the equipment of people who are exploring for oil in the northern seas. And this very poignant, moving representation of a whale watching her mother die is a moving way of drawing the reader into the problem, helping us to sympathize with this individual, though fictional, whale. And then Donovan moves into this multidimensional approach using neuroscience, cetology or whale biology, literary criticism, petroleum engineering, in different sections of her essay to give us a multifaceted picture of the experience of whales in the northern seas. So when I interviewed Donovan about her strategy for using language, Again, this is related to my work as an eco-critic, not simply to write analyses of texts, but to speak with writers about their communication strategies and to present this information in the form of interviews in various formats. So on the Arithmetic of Compassion website, I have a number of these interviews with people. And Donovan, in writing about the way to use language in order to convey trans-species empathy, says many scholars have commented on the magnitude of our problem, of the problem our language-saturated human world poses for our ability to apprehend worlds outside of language, such as we're so saturated with and obsessed with language that how can we understand a species like whales, which doesn't use any kind of language like humans? Of course, they communicate through song and through other types of sound, but that's different from our particular type of language. Some would argue that this language saturation is insurmountable. But she, this young PhD student from Canada, says language can do a great deal that we do not often ask it to do, especially in academic work. And I find this a very inspiring statement, suggesting that we might experiment with our own academic language and attempt to push the boundaries, break the boundaries, communicate with different audiences by writing in different styles, such as she does in this essay that I mentioned a moment ago, for an academic collection on the environmental humanities and oil exploration in the northern seas. She produces this experimental multidimensional text. One of the recent articles that we've presented on the Arithmetic of Compassion website is by an Indian scholar from Kerala, V.K. Karthika, who writes about a photographer who attempts to convey vulnerability by representing Kerala artists wearing traditional clothing, standing in water near their flooded homes, which have been flooded due to tremendous storms associated with climate change. And so in the article, there are a number of images of particular photographer's work as the scholar Karthika analyzes the role of art, the role of visual art, particularly in helping us to feel the vulnerability of these individuals. So here I'm just about to finish, and the stories and images, such as the few examples that I've given you here, have the power to help us understand complex problems that we can't comprehend through quantitative information alone. And this convergence of story, visual image, philosophy, journalism, and psychology, as we've attempted to draw together in the Numbers and Nerves project, suggests the value of collaboration among thinkers in a wide range of disciplines. This is another thing that I've come to learn through many years of working on different projects, all associated with communicating about environmental problems in a way that raises awareness and tries to stimulate action, that we need to work across disciplines to find new ways of breaking the conventions of our academic language and our ability to think about these problems in order to achieve some traction and make some progress on these very complicated problems. So that's the end of my PowerPoint, and I'm going to stop sharing now and invite any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Slovik, for such a wonderful talk. I now request all the participants to ask questions or share your thoughts.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, sir. So, I'm Bindushree, research scholar at VIT AP. So, I have a question regarding So do you think man-made inscape art is the new mode of expression for artists? Do you think naturalistic expression has lost its value in the present time, sir?
Naturalistic expression. I'm not quite sure what you mean by naturalistic expression. Maybe you could offer a little more information about that.
I mean, the artist, the artist name is the artist
I'm
who
afraid,
has created the work of plastic. So
yes.
it's a kind of naturalistic expression that has lost its value in the present time. That means the natural art is not having demand or what a kind of importance, or it can draw the audience attention towards it. So how would you
Yeah.
think about
Yeah.
the mode of expression nowadays with the artist?
Okay, I think I understand better what you're saying. Thank you for this question. Yeah, I think Chris Jordan does not specifically work in a naturalistic mode. I would agree. There's something more symbolic about his representation of the data of various types of problems with our consumption of natural resources and our production of various types of pollution, such as plastic pollution. So I would agree with you that his work is more symbolic um, than naturalistic. But he does have a film about um, oh, what are they? Uh, the words escaping me right now. The seagoing birds that live on Pacific islands that are now tremendously endangered due to plastic pollution. Um, I'll think of the example as soon as I stop talking. But
Seagulls, I think you mean. But
yeah, seabird, a particular type of seabird. Anyway, it's kind of a classic seabird. Coleridge writes about them. What's the name of the seabird that he writes about?
seagulls, I think, right?
Not
The
not
seagulls, not
seagulls.
seagulls.
Albatross.
Albatrosses. Sorry. Yes, he has a beautiful film about albatrosses and their endangerment, where it's more naturalistic, I would say, than the digital compositions that I was presenting to you from his Running the Numbers series. But on the other hand, to me, although Leopold's essay is naturalistic, he tells the story, an actual narrative in I would say, a fairly naturalistic writing style of having a personal experience as a young man encountering a pack of wolves and trying to kill those wolves because of a mistaken point of view that he had. And then he talks about his change of heart. As he approaches the dying wolf, he experiences a change of heart. And then he through this revelation, he's come to realize how misguided his philosophy regarding natural resource management had been. So I think Leopold's example is much more naturalistic in a traditional literary sense, and Jordan's way of approaching the trans-scalar representation of an environmental problem, a problem of contamination and sustainability, happens to be somewhat more symbolic. But I would encourage you to look at Jordan's website, www.chrisjordan.com, and go to the Running the Numbers series. He has part 1 and part 2 of that series. And if you go to each of the images, you click on the image and it moves toward you. So you see the general image as if from a distance, and then it simulates the process of our walking up close to it in an art gallery and looking at the individual items. It simulates this technologically on his website, so you can see the individual items that he's representing, and then you back away, or you click again, and the image seems to move out from you. So you move back and forth between the individual and the many, the close up and the far away, and you read the caption in order to realize what he's attempting to convey. Is how he's essentially trying to train our minds to be more flexible, because in order to live in the world today and appreciate the relationship between individual stories and large-scale phenomena, we need this pliability, this flexibility in our imagination. So this may not, I realize the conference is focusing on the environmental humanities and eco-criticism, and it may seem that what I'm talking about is not really eco-criticism, but I am an eco-critic. I'm an interdisciplinary environmental humanities scholar, and I'm interested in modes of communication, not just in analyzing and interpreting literary texts by myself as one mind attempting to figure out what a text is meaning in all of its subtleties, but I'm interested, I've come over the years to be interested in this broader issue of effective communication. I've basically become a communication studies scholar, an interdisciplinary communication studies scholar, because I think that's one of the directions that we need to be moving in as a discipline of eco-criticism in order to make our work relevant to how our societies respond to various kinds of challenges that we face. So that's one reason why I find myself analyzing the work of Chris Jordan and analyzing Alda Leopold, not just by placing them in a particular artistic or cultural tradition, but by looking at them in what may seem like a non-literary communication-focused way. What are their communication strategies? What seems to be particularly effective or not so effective? And I mentioned toward the very end, I mentioned empirical eco-criticism. I didn't really explain that, but essentially it means to design experiments to study the way audiences respond to particular texts. And that's one of the directions that I think our field may be headed. I'm sorry for going on. I think other people have questions or comments, so please go ahead.
Participants, you can ask questions. If you have any question, please directly ask to Dr. Scott Slovic.
Sir, good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, I have a doubt that is related not to this lecture especially, but I have a general doubt. Can you elaborate on technological singularities relation to environmental problems? Because since it's a digital age, the technology are advancing so rapidly, and how can it impact the environment very directly?
I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on this idea of technological singularities. What were you thinking of?
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Sir, now everything has been mechanized, and people are forgetting the natural process in everything. We have genetically modified crops, we have genetically modified species, and humans are replaced by machines and AI technologies everywhere. So how can you think that it is affecting human lives as well as the environmental lives?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on these technologies, but I'm interested in our use of technology. I think that technology can actually be quite effective in helping us to live more sustainably and to lighten our ecological impact in some ways. I worry that some of these technologies are simply ways of achieving greater efficiency in order to produce more, to support larger and larger human populations. And I think our ecological footprint has a lot to do with the combination of population size and consumerism, level of consumption. And I think if we simply try to use technologies to more efficiently produce more goods and feed more and more people, ultimately that may be problematic. Also, I'm thinking as I speak that another aspect of technology is that it mediates and in some ways limits our direct contact with the world. And so that we lose, and this may be related to the first question as well about naturalistic narrative versus non-naturalistic narrative. Increasingly, it seems many of us are losing our sense of contact with the world, and our understanding of quote unquote nature is mediated through technology and technological representations, which means we have a shallower and shallower appreciation of what it means to be an organism as we are living along with many other organisms on this planet, sharing the planet. It starts to seem very abstract to us, our relationship to the natural world. And so I would say that's perhaps a significant danger, the lack of direct contact with the world as we become more and more beholden to media of various kinds. So I'm actually quite interested in how it is that we try to sometimes step out of our offices, step away from our screens, and go into the world, and then return to tell stories of our direct contact with the world. So I think we need to push back a little bit against the various forms of mediation, technological mediation that many of us encounter in our lives. Let's see, I think people may be asking questions in the chat. I've seen some pop up, but I don't have them on my screen right now.
Yes, I'm going to take the questions. Let me check.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Let me check the chat box. I think there is one question from Pragya Paramita. Professor, I could relate your argument regarding sensitivity towards some with oil-induced climate crisis in Nigeria. Could you please mention some work that I can explore to know more in the context of oil and Nigeria?
Well, again, that's not my specific area of expertise, but there are eco-critics who are writing about literary works from Nigeria on the subject of oil. And actually, if you would write an email to me, directly to me, I can look up the title of some eco-critical studies of Nigerian petrofiction. So there is literary work from Nigeria specifically about the oil issue, and quite a few eco-critics from Nigeria and other countries are studying that literature in eco-critical ways. But I don't have the titles at the tip of my tongue, but would be happy to. Yes, that's a good one. Yeah, Helan Habila is one of the people who's often studied by eco-critics. Yeah, great example. Yeah, but I know some specific eco-critical articles that study that work, and would be happy to share them with you if you would just send me an email directly.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Slovik. There is one question from Hema that can you please tell us about eco-grief and why only few feel that, and how to overcome the gripping grief?
Yeah, interesting question. Some of my recent lectures have actually been on emotion and environment in the Anthropocene. And yeah, there's a recent collection called Affective Ecocriticism, 2018 collection of articles that has a number of pieces specifically on eco-grief. My argument, though, is that despite the feeling of eco-grief that many people feel, I think there's not enough emotional response to our environmental challenges, that we tend to be living in a condition of complacency where many of us go about our lives as usual, relatively insensitive to the seriousness of our environmental situation. So one of the major studies of eco-grief in the context of climate change is Sarah Jaquette Ray's recent book called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, which is a book she wrote specifically for her university students, trying to give them various strategies for responding to their grief and distress and anxiety that they feel as they think about climate change. So I would recommend that you specifically look at this book, Affective Ecocriticism, edited by Kyle Bladow and Jennifer Ladino, and also maybe look for Sarah Ray's book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, if you want much more in-depth response to eco-grief. Again, my own thought is that a certain amount of grief and anxiety is not a bad thing, that we need more of that because we truly live in a distressing situation on the planet. And yet we don't want paralyzing grief and anxiety. I think the challenge is to pique our concern, to be appropriately, functionally concerned, but not to be paralyzed by these concerns. I think one of the issues that we might explore as scholars in the environmental humanities, perhaps through some empirical studies, is to see what types of texts, not only literary texts, but texts in other media, inspire a sense of awareness and concern and agency, of being empowered and able to act on an individual level or a collective level in order to respond effectively to these problems. The danger is, and the reason why people, I think, descend into paralyzing grief, is that they feel disempowered and without agency. And so we want to find certain texts that demonstrate effective ability to respond to the problems and not simply be overwhelmed by them. In the example of climate change, one literary work that I think may display this is Barbara Kingsolver's famous novel Flight Behavior, where the main character, young woman protagonist, actually ends up becoming an empowered person in a new way as a result of her growing awareness of climate change and her involvement with certain scientists who are studying this problem. So the main character in that novel, Flight Behavior by Kingsolver, develops an enhanced sense of self. And as her knowledge of climate change increases, she also becomes an empowered person, able to feel more independent in her life. So it demonstrates agency in an impressive way. That's a book that I think is less likely to be paralyzing and to induce eco-grief than some other texts.
Thank you, Dr. Slovi. We have one more question that from Himal Pandey. Sir, is there a work that connects psychological trauma with nature and healing?
Yes. Well, so a book that I published recently with my colleagues from Chennai, Swarnalata Rangaranjan and Vidya Sarveswaran, is the Bloomsbury Handbook to the Medical Environmental Humanities. And there's a chapter in this book by Samantha Walton from Bath Spa University in the UK, where she studies the eco-recovery memoir. She coins that phrase, eco-recovery memoir, and she looks at particular examples of text. I think she's primarily interested in the nonfiction memoir, and she gives several examples of memoirs that tell the stories of individuals who've been suffering some kind of psychological trauma, and they recover from this trauma or this depression by way of their contact with nature. Or somehow they achieve a sort of psychological stability as a result of a positive connection that they experience with the non-human world. So Samantha Walton's article, I think, is a particularly good example of this. It's her novel, or her article is called Eco-Recovery Memoir and the Medical Environmental Humanities. It's chapter 9 in this very recent book that was just published in 2022. The Bloomsbury Handbook to the Medical Environmental Humanities. So that's what comes to mind when I think of a good psychological approach to kind of a positive recovery from a psychological distress that an individual might experience, and the role of nature in supporting this recovery. So I hope what I presented was interesting, and that it made sense to you, and seems relevant to what you're all talking about at this conference. And I wish you all the best with the rest of your meetings, and have a very successful seminar. thank you for inviting me to speak to you.
Hello. Hello. So can you hear
Hello,
me? Good
I
morning. So
can.
I have a question too. So as you're speaking of emotion and affect, there's a new paradigm that has come about in the field of geography, geography of emotions and affect. So it's more of an extension of humanistic geography. So my question is there anything you could tell us about the gender differences in response to climate change? How men and women react differently to climate change? Because it's mostly seen that men are more apathetic, they don't care about climate change, but women are more concerned about climate change. So even in the Indian Sundarbans, among the climate refugees, this can be seen. So is there anything you could tell us about that, please?
I haven't seen much research on the gender differences in people's responses to climate change. That's an interesting argument that you're presenting, but I haven't seen data on that subject. So I would need to do some research on that and see if what has been published. And if there hasn't been much work on it, it seems like a very good topic to study further. So that's a good question. A number of the scholars that I know in the environmental humanities who do study climate change and are clearly concerned about climate change happen to be male scholars. So at least in my very quick, informal effort to respond to your question, I do see some balance between male and female scholars who are keenly interested and concerned about climate change. But as far as the general public goes, I really don't know, and would need to see some data. I'm sorry.
I think there is some background noise.
Okay.
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Oh no. Anyway, I'm repeating myself. That I think this is a very interesting topic. Not only to look for gender differences in emotional responses to climate change and other types of environmental issues and concerns, but also maybe cultural differences. So I think a lot of the psychological data may have been gathered specifically in Western countries. And there are different ideas about personal identity, the individual versus the collective in Western countries than may be the case in certain other societies. So it might be a good idea to try to reproduce some of the psychological studies that I mentioned earlier and that are described in much more detail in the book Numbers and Nerves, to reproduce these with psychologists and other social scientists and environmental humanities scholars in a country like India, and then to compare the data, because the results could be different and there could be some specific cultural biases in different societies. So I would use that caveat about some of the ideas that I presented briefly here.
Thank you, Dr. Stobik. There are two more questions. Would you like to take them
Sure.
in the chat box?
Oh, I don't.
In the chat
I
box,
don't.
I'm reading the question. Just a
Please do.
moment.
Okay, thank you.
So there is one question from Jayasri Singh. Sir, how would you say the poet Coleridge had dealt temptation, trauma, and testament? Out of three, the best dealt in the last section of the Ancient Mariner.
It's been too many years since I studied the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. I can't remember the last section specifically. So I would be I couldn't clearly respond to that unless I had the text in front of me. I'm sorry. But do you have any theories about that?
I think we can go to the next question, sir.
Okay.
There is one question from Uzma Nishat. How climate change has impacted multilingual idiomatic repertoire?
What was the last word? A multilingual.
Multilingual idiomatic repertoire.
I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
Okay, that's all. That's okay.
Okay.
I think that's all in the chat box. And
okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish we had more time to develop these questions further, and I'm sorry I couldn't answer all of them directly, but thank you for your interest in this topic and for listening to me. So I see there are many more questions coming up in the chat box, but I can't read them from my particular perspective. So if you would like to write to me directly, you're welcome to do that. I think it's easy to find my email online, or the organizers of the seminar can provide it. So thank you very much. I wish you all the best and enjoy the rest of the seminar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Slobi, for a wonderful session on eco-criticism and diverse aspects. I would like to now thank Dr. Thaya Afzal for her constant support and encouragement to organize this national seminar on eco-criticism. I thank our CTS, the IT department, for their technical support. I also thank all the participants for joining this morning session. Today, we also have a session in the afternoon from 3 p.m. And Dr. Nivedita Bandyopadhyay is going to talk about post-colonial eco-criticism, the relevance of post-colonial eco-criticism. Thank you all. Thank you for joining. And now I officially ending the session.
Dr. Scott Slovic, so happy to meet you in person. I've heard so much about you from Vidya Sarveshwaran and Swarnalata. And you also mentioned Kartika in your presentation. She was my colleague here at VITAP. So it's a pleasure to have you here today with us.
Wonderful, wonderful. Nice to meet you in person, virtually in person. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.